Well, you might know this already, but it turns out that humans can drastically alter biomes depending on what we do. And a few examples of that. Example number one would just be going back to the forests. If we clear forests, so take the trees out of the forest, this can very much lead to drastic consequences in that biome, right? It's going to essentially change it from being forest to being something else. So why would we do this? Sometimes we do this in order to use the land. Maybe we want to grow some other sort of crop there, so for agricultural use this might be done. Or we might want to use the trees directly for lumber, for producing paper sorts of products, or just wood that we might need for building. There are also examples of humans changing forests just due to pollution. So if pollution is bad enough, that can start to kill the trees, kill off the forest. So in the end, where there used to be a forest, there is no forest anymore. There's a neat sort of picture that shows the effects of human activities. This is a picture in a very remote Brazilian forest in 1975. As you can see, it's very lush, very green. And then the very same area in the year 2001. And quite drastic change. So what happened here is there was a highway that was paved through that region, and then that ended up leading to a lot of loggers and farmers starting to travel into this area, and you can see the forest is much diminished compared to what it used to be. So one more example. Pumping groundwater. This is something that we certainly do in California in order to water crops and just to provide enough water for people to live here. And this is something that over time can very drastically change a landscape. So when we pump a lot of water out of the ground, what's going to happen over time is the land itself will actually start to drop because there's not as much water underneath of us anymore. So that can lead to different sorts of topological changes on the surface of the earth, but other sorts of consequences is just very much a change in the vegetation on the surface. If we're pumping a lot of water up to the surface, then that's going to modify what sorts of plants can go in this region. So for this one, picture of Las Vegas. This is Las Vegas in 1973. And then the population grew pretty substantially over the next couple of decades. And here's Las Vegas in the year 2013. So just look how much more green this area is. That's due to watering plants, residential lawns, for example. And so very much changed from what it used to be. So this is something that care should be taken in doing this. It's not necessarily that these things are always bad to do. It's just we need to be careful how we do them in order to be sustainable long term. So, right, in the case of water, if we just keep pumping and don't pay attention to how much is left in the reserves, then we might actually run out somewhere down the road, and that could be pretty disastrous. So this leads us to the idea of sustainability. Sustainability has a very specific goal in mind. Sustainability practices strive to meet our needs today, so provide us with the resources that we need, whether it's lumber or water or what have you, but to do that in a way that doesn't compromise the ability of future generations to do the very same thing. So this takes some thought, this takes some planning how to do this. And one of the things that we are going to particularly be focused on in terms of sustainability is with regards to our atmosphere. Our atmosphere influences so many things about how we live, and so we're just going to look at that as an example of how to be sustainable. So this brings us to greenhouse gases. I'm sure you have heard of greenhouse gases. We're going to elaborate on them perhaps a little bit more than what you might have known already, or maybe you already know all of this, in which case this will be review. What are greenhouse gases? Greenhouse gases are gases that exist in the atmosphere, so in the air around us and above us. And these are gases that tend to trap heat close to the surface of the earth. So this means that the heat cannot escape. They do let solar energy through. So it's like the energy from the sun can make it down to the surface of the earth, but then the heat has a hard time escaping. So these gases, essentially they act like a blanket, is the analogy that's often used, and it's a good analogy. Examples of greenhouse gases. So what sorts of gases are greenhouse gases? There are many different sorts of greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is the one that we'll be focused on. That is the primary greenhouse gas that we can have some sort of influence over. Other sorts of greenhouse gases include methane, water even. Water that has evaporated water can act as a greenhouse gas. And then CFCs, these are chlorofluorocarbons. These are molecules that used to be released sort of by people with, so aerosol cans, the thing that makes, not saying this very well, aerosol cans used to have CFCs in them, and we didn't know it at the time, but CFCs were actually greenhouse gases, and this ended up causing problems, and now we don't use CFCs anymore because they're greenhouse gases. In a nutshell. Hope that made some sense. Okay, so carbon dioxide is the one that we're going to be focused in on, and carbon dioxide comes from a couple of different sources. So we have seen carbon dioxide quite a bit in this class in the context of cellular respiration, right? Every time a cell breaks down a molecule of glucose, it produces carbon dioxide as a waste product. So this is something that is produced naturally, very naturally, in fact, by every living thing. However, it is also produced by combusting fossil fuels. And so this is a good summary picture here. We've got respiration, cellular respiration going on. That's releasing carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere. Also, we've got combustion of fossil fuels, gasoline, for example, burning gasoline. That's also producing carbon dioxide, which is released into the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide is something that we have historical data about. And if we compare the levels from before the Industrial Revolution and afterwards, the levels have risen quite significantly. And so that suggests that combusting fossil fuels, this is something that is significantly increasing the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. So how do we deal with this? What normally deals with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Well, that's where the plants come into play. Plants carry out photosynthesis, and other things carry out photosynthesis too in the oceans. But photosynthesis is the thing that absorbs this carbon dioxide and uses it, right? Builds it into other useful forms like plant bodies. So the concern is that if we are producing a lot of carbon dioxide, and if we are also carrying out deforestation, so getting rid of plants, the concern is that photosynthesis might not be able to keep up. So it might not be able to absorb all of the carbon dioxide that we're producing. All right, we might need more plants, not less plants, in order to do that. So as carbon dioxide starts to build up in the atmosphere, if the plants can't take care of all of it, then what's going to occur is the ocean will start to absorb some of the extra. So this is something that we have seen in a lab. We checked out what happens if you add carbon dioxide into the air near water. Well, the water is going to become more acidic. We looked at that reaction in lab earlier in the semester. So carbon dioxide being absorbed by the ocean is going to lead to acidification of the ocean waters. That in turn will affect many things that live in the ocean. Just to give one example, corals and mollusks, these are organisms that would no longer be able to build their hard shells or exoskeletons because the calcium gets pulled out of them if the water is too acidic. So that very much leads to damaged marine ecosystems. So next question is, all right, so if we know carbon dioxide is a problem, what can we do about it? And there are ways to reduce our carbon emissions. This is called reducing our carbon footprint, and things that individuals can do. So certainly there are things that major companies can do in order to decrease industrial emissions, but aside from that, just looking at each of us individually, what can each of us do to reduce our carbon footprints? Things like, well, the little things really, if we all do them, they do add up. So turning off lights when you're not using them, turning off the TV when you leave the room. If you're not actually watching the TV, go ahead and turn it off. Unplugging devices that are not in use. So this one's kind of interesting. Some chargers, some devices, laptop chargers, cell phone chargers, if you leave them plugged in, okay, even if you're not actively charging your phone or your laptop, but just you've got it still plugged into the wall, some chargers just always draw a little bit of electricity from the socket, and so they're sort of acting like vampires. They're just always draining the electricity, even though we're not actively trying to charge our cell phone. So that's something you can just unplug if you're not using it in the moment, and that will decrease your carbon footprint over time. You can also do things like increase energy efficiency. So the energy that you do use, use technology that makes the most efficient use possible. So a good example of this would be switching to LED light bulbs, energy efficient light bulbs in your house. They're more expensive upfront, but over time that cost pays off because they're using less energy over time. So you get that money back in the long term. Also, just maintaining your car, making sure that your car is well maintained so that it's burning fuel efficiently. That's very effective. Also, just decreasing how much you drive can be a very good thing to do. And then finally, last couple of points to consider, buying locally produced goods. So that one, kind of have to think about that one for a second. How would that decrease your carbon footprint? Well, if you're buying things from across the country, then what happens? It has to be shipped to you, so it has to be transported. It's probably being transported by a big truck, and that truck has to burn fossil fuels in order to get your supplies to you. So if you buy local, then there's less transportation going on, less carbon emissions that way. Also, last on the list, you can consider your meat choices. So some types of meat have arguably a more substantial impact on the environment than others. Things like beef, cows, just naturally they produce more methane than what some of these other animals would. And so choosing to eat fish, chicken, and eggs and veggies instead of beef, sometimes that is a recommendation in order to lower our carbon footprint.